Thank you for joining us for this week's AccuWeather Podcast, Everything Under the Sun. I'm your host, meteorologist Regina Miller. Heat led the 6 p.m. newscast on most TV sets across the country back in 1988. Here's a flashback to Peter Jennings from ABC's World News Tonight.
It wasn't even noon today when the temperature at Sioux Falls in South Dakota was over 100. In Georgia, a woman died from heat stroke while she was working in a tobacco field. There was some rain in Iowa today, which was good for the soybeans. But in some parts of Illinois, there is no moisture available in the top 6 inches of soil. And here in the Northeast, there has been a break in the heat. It is in the Midwest and the South where the drought and the heat still hold people and animals and the land in their grip.
Some estimates are between 4,800 to 17,000 deaths could be attributed to the heat during that summer when the country was plagued by 2 concurrent heat waves. It led to the North American Drought of 1988 and 89. There was significant crop loss by farmers. Andy, we just came off a heat wave recently in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic.
That's right, and we're going to be talking about this 1988 heat wave, which had temperatures quite similar to those in the 1930s, and we're going to be joined by meteorologist Dave Dombek to talk about when he was here at AccuWeather forecasting the historic heat wave that we could say spurred the national discussion on global warming. We'll talk about the significance of it coming up.
Well, we have meteorologist Dave Dombek back in the studio, and Andy and I were talking. How many times do you think we've had Dave?
It's
like
him
20
and Evan
times.
Myers are the two people with the most appearances on the podcast.
I got the clicker. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, there's the next one. Notch it in.
So we've had you in here so many times, Dave. When did you start forecasting here at AccuWeather?
July 28th, 1980.
Oh, so that's why we have you in here so often,
Yes.
because who else here has a better track record of like the weather that's occurred and just watching these different phenomena?
Just a handful of people here have more years than I do here.
Right. I think that's why you and Evan are on here the most often.
Well,
So-
congratulations on your anniversary.
Thank you.
I know. That's really cool. That's
Yep.
really cool. So, Dave, today we are talking about this heat wave that affected much of the country back in 1988.
Mm-hmm.
And so right before this podcast, you and I walked out and we were kind of just checking on some of the records that still stand today. Baltimore, for example, on July 16th, 1988, these were all the cities. So Baltimore was 104 on July 16th. Dayton was 102 on the 15th of July. Indianapolis, 103. Chicago was 102 degrees. And Columbus was 100. So all those cities were at or over the century mark at that point in time.
State College, Pennsylvania, where some summers it's tough to get it to 90. On July 16th, 1988, it was 102.
Right.
That was only the second time in my life here in State College that I experienced 100 degrees or higher. Only the second time.
Oh,
Another time
wow.
was back in 2011, I believe.
Right. And the other thing, too, that we have, like a lot of these states that would have been impacted were also impacted with humidity or not.
Actually, believe it or not, there was some humidity from time to time, but it was not, what we experienced earlier this summer, some of the tropical rainforest type humidity. It was actually just the opposite. It was more of a dry heat. A lot of the times. It was humid, but not the excessive, the tropical type humidity. And that's kind of goes into the whole idea of the drier it is, the hotter it's going to be. The hotter it is, the drier it's going to be. The two sort of feed off of each other. And that's why it was not only just heat wave, but it was drought. And that was really the economic impact was really serious from an agricultural standpoint with the crop loss, corn especially, but other crops as well. And, when you think about this, on any given day, when the sun's up and the sun heats the ground, and then in turn the ground heats up the air. That's how the temperature rises on any given day. That's how it works. And if you have a normal situation or a wetter than normal situation like we had last summer, it was so wet, there's a lot of water to evaporate. Puddles, standing water, just the vegetation being lush and green and really thriving. There's a lot of moisture that evaporates off of plants, off of grass and corn and trees and so forth. So the sun on any given day in any given place, you only have so much energy available. And if some of that energy is going into evaporating water, that's less energy that's available to heat the air up.
Right.
But when everything is just dry,
so it had more of like a Midwest kind of desert kind of...
yeah, it was at times. And it was interesting, like around here in State College, central Pennsylvania, I don't know if I'll ever experience this again in my lifetime. 15 days, you know how tough it is to get it to 90 in State College because of our elevation and so forth? We had a 15-day stretch where it got to 90 or better. From July 4th of that year, it kicked in. It was 90, I think, even that day, up through the 18th. 15 days in a row. The hot days were like 95 to 99 with that 102 on the 16th. And the dew points might have been in like the low to mid 60s. So it's humid, but not like excessive. The cool days behind cold fronts that came through dry with a wind shift and
so they
kicked
never
up
even
the dust.
they never even caused any rainfall when they would be coming
No,
through.
they would come through as dry fronts and some clouds, and it looks like it was going to do something, and it just didn't generate anything but a wind shift and a pressure rise, and it kicked up the dust, and that's all it did. And so the cool days behind fronts were like 90 to 92 with deep blue skies and like 48 to 52 dew points. It was unbelievable, and we had that for a 15-day stretch. That year, if you look at the pattern, that the heat was really intense that first half of July, and then it backed off the second half of July, like from the 19th or so to the end of the month. The heat did back off a little. It got a little wetter. But unfortunately, like for the corn crop and things like that, it was a little too late to really salvage things. And then the heat came roaring back in August, like the first half of August of that year. It got really hot once again. And it was interesting, if you look at what happened, some of the most extreme heat was right there in that, it's like the last gasp of that heat wave up in the Northeast. It lasted longer farther south, but right after that broke, it was dramatic because the patterns, like it flipped the switch, and it was almost like it was the end of summer. It got cool, it got wet. It was just a totally different pattern. It never even, the rest of that summer of 88, it was like it struggled to even get really warm. It was so weird the way that it broke very dramatically. But like I said, at that point, the corn crop and it was just way too late in the game. It was just everything was cooked and dead. And I mean, I remember walking around the grass around here. You didn't have to cut your grass for long stretches that summer.
Well, it was probably as soon as you would, the mower would just kick up a bunch of dust.
Everybody knows like what shredded wheat looks like. I mean, that was like the grass. It was dead. It was crunchy. And that was the grass. Even some trees and bushes that weren't deeply rooted died. It was just unbelievable. And the setup that summer, and a lot of people forget. Everybody remembers the July and the August heat, but people forget that the pattern that set that up was a back and forth battle in June. You'd have these fronts that would come through, mostly dry, little or no rain. These big Canadian highs would build down into the northeastern part of the country. So it would be cool, sometimes unusually chilly for a day or two. Those highs would then get off the southeast coast or the mid-Atlantic coast, turn around into a heat pump high. So 3 days later, it was getting hot. And then you'd repeat the process. So we were back and forth like a roller coaster ride with very little rain. That was the key there. It was dry.
Because it's a Canadian.
It was Canadian origin.
High, yeah, so it's drier.
On July 10th, parts of north central Pennsylvania had frost, believe it or not. Or not July 10th, June 10th.
Before this all started.
Before this all started, there was scattered frost on June 10th of 1988, and so, but it was the dryness that was the key.
Yeah, because of where it was coming from, because of where that high was coming from. It's so atypical.
Yep.
Because normally we would expect, the eastern part of the country to be affected by the Bermuda high pushing back westward and having some moisture wrap around that. But this one was coming from the north, so pretty different phenomenon.
And that pattern was so persistent, too. And really the setup was a big ridge, sprawling ridge. It covered a good chunk of the country, pretty much from like the east slopes of the Rockies out through the plains all the way to the east coast. Very sprawling high. And the source region of the air, much of the time, was not the Gulf of Mexico. It was continental air that was coming down through the Canadian prairies, through the northern plains, the Great Lakes. So it's
landlocked.
It was right, exactly. Right. It was more of a continental type flow. And so the Gulf of Mexico, we use the term, it was shut off. We shut the Gulf off for long stretches of time. And so you didn't have the really high dew points. You didn't have the source of moisture. And these fronts were coming through dry or very little, a skinny little line of broken showers, or thunderstorms, and that was all that was happening. So that was the setup for a lot of the time that summer, and that's why the dryness. And again, one thing fed on the other. The dryness fed the heat fed the dryness. The hotter it is, the more you're going to evaporate. And so it was just the whole thing fed on itself.
And speaking of you mentioning about the dryness and how fronts had come through dry, some of the worst dust storms since the Dust Bowl were occurring during this particular event.
That's right.
And so we do have some sound from that.
There's the sun right there. It's all covered in dust. It's not cloudy out. It's perfectly clear. It's just dust. Very dusty. It's not clouds. There are no clouds in the sky except for this dust, whatever it is. It's pretty strange.
Now, every time there's some kind of weird weather phenomenon, like Twitter has videos everywhere. But back in 1988, how many people had a video camera? But this guy in Kansas just happened to capture it on video camera. But tell me about how big was this? How many states were really impacted by this?
If you counted them up, it was basically that chunk of territory from Denver, and especially as you get on into the high plains of Kansas and Nebraska, down to Oklahoma, all the way to the Dakotas, and on eastward, right to the East Coast. New England got into some of that at times. Far northeast New England, you get up into Maine, and that they were sort of on the edge of that. They had a few bouts where it did get hot, pretty hot, and so forth. But the extreme heat was more southwest New England and on west and south from there. I guess if you had the core, where the anomalies, where the departures from normal were the greatest, would be that area from like Madison, Chicago, Indianapolis, into Ohio, kind of western, central Pennsylvania, into the mid-Atlantic like Philly, D.C., Baltimore, Richmond. That slice of territory was probably where the epicenter of the extreme. And also, as far north as maybe even up into Minneapolis, St. Paul area, Detroit, got into that too. So it was really that area where that was like the bullseye of it, but it was very, very large territory of the country that was affected by that.
Well, so tell me about some of the extremes, like what was the impact, like some of the stories that came out of this?
I remember during that stretch, we were forecasting whether it was on radio, whether we were doing newspaper forecasts, any clients that we were trying to figure out the wording in our forecasts. And so let's say we had a case where a front would go through, probably dry or very little, and it was going to be a beautiful day the next day, very warm to hot, but low humidity and everything. We would purposely avoid using terms like nice or pleasant, because here farmers were like, their livelihoods were getting burned up in the field. There was no rain, their crops were dead or dying. And so we made sure that we were very sensitive to that. Any places that were in that drought, and the heat wave, the drought especially, that we didn't use descriptive terms that would
be like, it would make it seem like it was less of an issue, because it really was, because I saw an article in the New York Times at that point in time that in Iowa the drought destroyed 45% of the nation's corn crops.
Wow.
And caused a loss of more than $10 billion, and then thousands of farmers were out of business as a result of that. So, it was really impacting farming there in the nation's heartland. And you had mentioned corn around here, like how it looked so weird.
Yeah, it really looked sickly in some of the fields around here. Remember, if you could kind of just picture what a pineapple plant looks like.
Right, where it's just like you got a couple leaves at the bottom,
like,
and then just a big old stalk
nothing
in the middle.
Right, no height to it, and this like curly thing that just the leaves sort of the stalks sort of curl up, and very little height to them. A lot of corn stalks, they never really got the ear of corn on them, or if they did, they were stunted very much. With corn, I remember, I'm certainly far from being an expert in agriculture, but I do know, I have a garden, so I know this as a principle, it's common sense, that the bigger the plant is, it's able to shade the ground. So if you could get through that critical stage, like the early part of the season, early mid-season, once the corn stalks are high enough, they're shading the ground, and if you got enough moisture in there, you could go...
It'll retain it.
It'll retain the moisture in there, and you could go a long stretch without getting rain. But that was the problem, that June was so dry, July was so dry, and it was just at a critical time, and the corn stalks never got any height to them and never were able to shade the ground, and so they pretty much just sat out in the field and did nothing and shriveled up, and it was pretty sad. But yeah, I guess if you could kind of picture what a pineapple plant, that's kind of what the corn looked like. It was really pretty bad shape. Yeah,
right.
In terms of the drought, there was a lot of places that went days and days and days without precipitation. It says here that in my notes that Milwaukee went almost 55 days without precipitation. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, and it
That's
and it
crazy,
varies
isn't
from.
it?
But that's just for this part of the country. That would be in the desert Southwest or something.
Right.
But we're not talking. We're
But
talking
Milwaukee,
the
Wisconsin,
Midwest.
you wouldn't think.
The upper Midwest,
55
right.
days without rain.
It's like some summers, like you can't go 55 minutes without without a shower or thunderstorm popping up, let alone 55
It's pretty much every
days.
afternoon. It's gonna fire up.
Yep.
So one of the other things, one of the big things I think that was a result of this heat wave was not only droughts but also wildfires.
Right, absolutely. When you have it that dry and the trees, the bushes, the grass, all that stuff is like tinder dry. Like I said, I described it as
Shredded
walking
wheat.
on shredded wheat, crunchy and everything. All you have to do is just get somebody being careless with a campfire or burning.
Even like a strike of lightning, maybe?
Strike of lightning, absolutely.
You're actually
yes.
creating the same kind of weather pattern you have in the Southwest and just pushing it to the east.
To the east, yeah.
So just such a strange anomaly.
So it almost is kind of almost similar to what happened like in California, kind of like with how it was like a tinderbox.
It was a tinderbox, right. And there was not only that, but you also had days where there was a nice, pretty good breeze blowing, which you normally don't get much of a breeze on summer day. But this was a pattern where at times you'd get pretty breezy. And so here you just started a wildfire somewhere, and now you've got winds. Maybe not to the extent of the Santa Ana winds, but you had enough breeze that they had to deal with that as well. And I know from a forecasting standpoint, trying to hit the high temperatures day by day by day, and of course we had way less guidance, computer guidance models than we do today, and that's just a known entity. But what we did do in the guidance that we did have at the time, what we would do for any given spot, let's say we're forecasting for State College, Pennsylvania, or Philadelphia, wherever. And so we would say, okay, the predicted high on the models tomorrow is 95. Now, the models have been busting by 3 or 4 degrees because they're not factoring in how dry it is. And you look on what we call the Moss numbers and say, well, at 1 o'clock today or 2 o'clock today, it's supposed to be 92, and it's already 96. So you had to adjust. You had to say, okay, this is what the guidance says. We're going to add 4 or 5 on top of that.
Right.
And most of the time we were pretty close on those numbers because the numbers were not catching up to the dryness.
They
don't
allow
factor
for
that in, the
moisture
extreme
content.
dryness. Yeah.
Well, and I thought it was interesting too that out of this, and I don't know if you remember this. I was in college in the 80s. I remember writing a paper on it. So
as a young pup.
But I was a young pup. But but I remember, out of this heat wave is when you first started hearing about the greenhouse effect. Because Dr. James Hansen, he was an atmospheric physicist. He appeared before Congress in 1988, and he talked about the greenhouse effect really for the first time, bringing some national attention to it. And I thought it was interesting what he did because he created some dice out of like cardboard, and he used one die and he had it represent like 1950 to 1980. And he had it so that like the 6 sides, 2 sides were white for an average summer, 2 sides were blue for a cooler summer, and 2 sides were red for a hotter summer. So he said, like, up until this point, it'd be a roll of the dice, and you would have equal chances on all these.
Yep.
So then he created another dice, which it was funny because this is how he's explaining it to Congress. But he created another die that had 6 sides, and he said that it would represent from 1980 through the 90s. And he said the chance would increase to 55 to 80%. So he made 4 sides of the dice red.
Right, wow.
So that, like, just rolling the dice, your chances of getting hotter and hotter summers were going to be more likely. And that's when it really, because I remember I had to write a paper on chlorofluorocarbons and the greenhouse impact.
Wow.
But it really kind of, out of this heat wave, started a national conversation, I think, more than it had been in the past. But the other thing I wondered about is, so Dave, cities now, like, you'll have a heat emergency declared by a mayor or something. We had that just recently, and they'll have cooling centers. Do you remember if that was happening back at that time? Like, did they do that kind of stuff?
I don't think to the degree that they do today, not nearly. And I think that 88 was a big year that sort of, really started getting people more aware of that.
I think it woke us up.
Authorities. 95, of course, that was a horrible heat wave in Chicago, and where people died. And so I think it's from that late 80s into the 90s, some of the other heat waves we had, the mid-90s. Things really have changed. Not saying that they didn't do it, but I think there was a lot less awareness of it and proactive things that municipalities and cities and so forth did
to prepare, because like with the cooling centers and stuff, I remember hearing about 1995, for example, that in Chicago, I think the morgue, there was so many people, they had to put like ice trucks or refrigerated trucks, they had to put people's bodies in because of the fact that people were dying, and they couldn't even put them all in the morgues at the time. So like I think cities became more and more aware of the issues, but heat-related deaths. And the other thing I was thinking of is, I don't know about you. Did you have a car with air conditioning? Because that wasn't as common either.
No.
That's what I mean. Do you remember, like, a lot of the cars in the 80s, we didn't have air conditioning.
Nope.
So if
roll down the windows.
Roll down the windows, which is like you were in an oven, because I remember we didn't have air conditioning. It wasn't so common even for people to have central air, I don't think.
Was it mainly just like window units or just box fans? Or?
Yeah, a lot. Well, I remember like that was a big issue back
box
in the
fans,
1980s, box fans. But, I remember reading about or finding out about people being out trying to get air conditioning because it wasn't common in houses the way it is today.
That's a good
Definitely
point.
wasn't in cars, because I remember those big old heavy metal cars, back in the 80s, or, like mine was like an old Mazda or whatever, but it was a new Mazda at the time. It was an old one later, but no air conditioning, so you'd roll down the window. So if you had to do anything outside, it was like having a blowtorch on. Like, even if you're reaching speeds of 55, so you really couldn't do anything outside.
It's funny that you mention that, because my mom actually did have a Mazda with no air conditioning.
Oh, yeah, because I don't know. Back then it was a luxury. Now it's like, who buys a car without air conditioning? But back then,
do they even sell cars without air conditioning
anymore?
anymore?
Do they?
I don't think so. I don't
So
know.
you're like, I don't want that.
Right.
Even my 2010 Tacoma truck, and it's a basic bare box stick shift and crank windows, that has air conditioning, and it's got good air conditioning.
Right.
And that's a basic box in 2010, so yeah.
But it didn't back then. And so when you think about the heat then, when you're talking about cities like Chicago, where you might be sitting in traffic with no air conditioning.
Yeah.
Can you imagine even just going to work? If you're like an hour out in the car or driving home in the afternoon.
At least if you're driving down the highway, you've got that
right.
cooling 100-degree breeze coming through the window.
It might not do much, but at least you've got
the air's
movement.
moving, right, yeah.
But so that would have been something at that time that would have been very different,
That's a good point.
So now it's 2019, looking back from 1988. There were a lot of fatalities during this heat wave, which is sad, and a lot of, as Regina said, a lot of dollars in damages. But in 2019, Dave, when it comes to forecasting things like heat waves of this size and magnitude, how have things changed technology-wise and other ways?
And communicating, really, Dave, too, because, we have more opportunities to get the message out.
Oh, yeah, and I think that's huge right there, getting the message out. Maybe there was such a thing as an internet,
it would have been big
somewhere.
Computers in entire rooms.
In 1988, right? Like kind of mid-90s was really the big push for that. So you didn't have that. You didn't have all the social media platforms like we do today. And so the ability to get that information out and the access to information is so much better and quicker now today than it was back then. And also the guidance, the models. I always say that, of course, we go back to the idea we're almost modeled to death. But yes, we do have so much more information now, and the models have gotten better, and the guidance, and just being able to recognize a pattern like that ahead of time and sort of giving a heads up to cities and municipalities and authorities, say, hey, next week, middle and latter part of next week, for example, we're looking at this heat, and it may be more than just your run-of-the-mill heat. So just want to give you a heads up. We'll give you more detail as we get closer to that. And so just the ability to long-range some of this stuff and seasonal forecasts that we do here at AccuWeather. So, yeah, we have much more information and much greater capacity to get that information out to the public.
So these temperatures, when this happened in the 1988 heat wave, they haven't seen temperatures like that since the 1930s. Again, here we are in 2019. Could we see a heat wave stretch like that again?
Sure, absolutely. And Regina and I, just before we started the broadcast, we were looking at some records. And yes, we've had a number of heat waves, many times, where we've dealt with heat. This is 31 years ago, and some of those records are still on the books today. And so that tells you something. When you establish a record like that, some of these records that Regina had mentioned, and they're still on the books today.
Yeah. Wow.
And so, we've had a lot of heat since then, a lot of hot summers, and some of them are still on the books today. But sure, can something like this happen, this type of pattern? Absolutely. No doubt about it. Patterns are cyclical. Of course, this summer we've dealt with some more of the very humid, very, very humid type
and I don't know,
waves.
Dave, back at that time, did we even talk about heat indices? You talked about models, but then also communication. And
sure.
More awareness of the problems with heat, I think, is definitely out there more, because heat indices, no one knew what that was, and now people do. They are educated to that.
And the real, of course, AccuWeather
Real Feel,
which is even
AccuWeather
more
Real
advanced than the heat index for
Right.
sure.
Right.
Yeah, so I think we have more ability to get that messaging. Like it's, yes, the thermometer will say it's, X. However, it's going to feel like Y because of the other factors involved here. So this is pretty serious stuff. You got to really take precaution.
Right. Like even this most recent heat wave, I thought it was great. Like Philadelphia's mayor, New York's mayor, they declared heat emergencies for their cities, had all these cooling centers, because you think anyone, especially it would affect the poorer residents even more so, that maybe don't have access to air conditioning. So, even municipalities knowing better how to handle things like that.
Yeah, you think, our bodies are amazing machines, but they only have so much ability to cool themselves. There's only so much that a body can do, and you need external help, i.e. air conditioners and cooling centers and so forth.
Thanks so much, Dave. Always great talking to you.
My pleasure.
Dave's always a wealth of information. That's why we always have him back in here.
Always love having him in the studio. Absolutely.
Right. And, I thought it was interesting because we talk about different weather events. And according to NOAA, heat waves, they might be less exciting than some other things, are not as dramatic as disasters like tornadoes, hurricanes, or flooding, or even like thunderstorms. But heat waves kill more people in the United States than all other weather-related disasters combined.
I'm not going to say I'm 100% surprised, because when you look at those numbers, when we first kicked off the show today, saying between 4,800 and almost 18,000 deaths attributed to the heat during that heat wave, I kind of believe that.
Right, because there's a lot of heat-related illness. So we appreciate Dave talking to us today. We hope you'll join us back here next week when a brand new podcast drops.
And before we get out of here for this week, we're talking about heat waves. Here are some tips about how you can stay cool during a heat wave with AccuWeather Ready.
Heat waves are happening more and more frequently, and preparedness is more and more important to our safety. The main risks posed by a heat wave are not having enough water, dehydration, heat exhaustion and heat stroke, and overheating, which can make symptoms worse for people who already have problems with their heart or breathing. In general, you can address a heat wave on 3 levels. First, be prepared. Be prepared by learning in advance what you can about how to handle a heat wave. Do things like cleaning air conditioner filters, install cool lighting, and repair doors and windows. Second, be aware. Pay attention to weather forecasts and know when a heat wave is forecasted. And third, be proactive. Act when a heat wave actually happens. What are some ways to be proactive? Close blinds that are exposed to the sun during the day and open them at night if the temperature has dropped. Stay out of the sun from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. Wear light, loose-fitting cotton clothes. Drink plenty of fluids to stay hydrated. Use fans for cooling, and use microwaves to cook instead of ovens. Turn off electronics that may be hot. If you do have to go out, use sunscreen, wear a hat or light scarf, and walk in the shade when possible. For more safety and preparedness tips, go to AccuWeather.com/ready. For AccuWeather, I'm Holly Holdren.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Be sure to subscribe to AccuWeather's Everything Under the Sun, giving you the stories behind the weather and so much more. New episodes every Thursday. Just search for AccuWeather on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or visit AccuWeather.com/podcast.